We have now spent a decent amount of time examining the importance of water quality and the things within water that we need to be particularly careful about relative to the safety and health of the drinking water consumed by our customers. So now let's spend some time talking about practices and procedures within the distribution system to ensure water quality, the monitoring programs and the sampling programs that determine how we make sure that we comply with the total coliform rule, with the lead and copper rule, with the disinfection byproducts rule, etc. We start with some types of sample collection methods. The first is what we call a grab sample. A grab sample is a sample in which we are taking a single volume of water at a specific place at a specific time. It provides kind of a quick view of what the water quality condition is at that specific time. It doesn't tell us what happened 5 minutes before. It's not telling us what's expected to happen 5 minutes after. We're grabbing a sample right there, right then. It provides a bit of a snapshot. The reality is most potable water system sampling utilizes grab samples. It's what is typically required to demonstrate compliance. We don't want or we can't use anything that's going to create any kind of an average. We're looking at what's happening in the distribution system at that particular point in time. Another type of sampling, not very common for water distribution systems, but just so we're aware, is a composite sample. A composite sample is basically a series of grab samples that are combined together, collected from the same point but at different times, and mixed together. They will provide more of an average value over a period of time. There's a couple different types of composite samples. The first is a time composite sample, which is basically a composite sample made up of equal volume samples collected at regular intervals. So perhaps every hour it takes a 500 milliliter sample and then combines it all together. A flow proportional composite sample is one in which it's a composite sample made up of samples collected at regular intervals, but the size of each sample is proportional to the flow at the time of sampling. So composite samples are used relatively extensively in wastewater analysis. In fact, the picture you see here is a composite sampler at the El Toro Water District water recycling plant. So as you can see, there's a sample, an automatic sampler, and basically a bucket for all intents and purposes, a big jar, big bottle that combines those samples. And then we do wastewater analysis and sampling based on that, which is fine for wastewater analysis, but again, most of the regulations that require water quality sampling for a drinking water system are going to require grab samples. Take a quick look at the bottles that we typically use for sampling. It's important to use the proper sample bottle for different types of tests. The picture you see here demonstrates a few of the bottles we use for sampling. The one on the left is a 500 milliliter bottle. We'll use that for samples that we're doing tests for chlorine, for ammonia, for nitrite. All of the physical analysis we do, whether it be color, odor, pH, turbidity, those all come from that 500 milliliter bottle. Next to that in the middle you see a 100 milliliter bottle. Those are the primary vessels we use to test for the microbiological safety of our drinking water, to the total coliform rule compliance. That comes from that 100 milliliter bottle. The one on the right is a 250 milliliter bottle that we use for disinfection byproduct testing. One of the things that you'll see, especially in bottles that you're using for BACTs or microbiological testing, you see the little white powder in these bottles. That material is sodium thiosulfate. Sodium thiosulfate it basically neutralizes chlorine. We use it as essentially a preservative. We don't want if there is any bacteriological contamination of the water, we don't want chlorine further acting with it between the time we take the sample and we get it to the lab. So we want to make sure that we catch anything that's out there. You will also, we'll talk later on about the need to dechlorinate any water that we are discharging from our system. While chlorine has made our drinking water safe, it's not so good for aquatic life, especially chloramines. So the requirement of the regional water quality control boards are typically that we don't discharge any chlorine to the receiving water. So if we're going to be discharging anything, we'll use sodium thiosulfate once again to neutralize the chlorine before it goes anywhere. The sampling in the distribution system is based on a series of sample points. The location of those sample points becomes key relative to the ability for them to represent conditions within the system. Most samples are being used to test for coliform bacteria and for chlorine residual as well. Within the El Toro Water District, we have 19 dedicated sample points. That's for our system. You'll have larger systems with many more, smaller systems with somewhat less. Those are the dedicated sample points. As we talked before, we'll also have upstream and downstream sample points for each one of those locations. We also pull samples from our storage tanks, from all of our sources of supply. We do weekly, monthly, quarterly tests, literally thousands of annual tests to demonstrate compliance. The locations of those sample points are based on ultimately a sampling plan approved by the Division of Drinking Water, but the primary considerations are that they be representative of each source of water entering the system and representative of various conditions within the system. For example, we will have sample points within each pressure zone. We'll have the potential for, and you may, depending on the system, need to have sample points at storage facilities, maybe at dead ends. But again, the important thing is that they be representative of each different source of water entering the system, or of any various conditions within the system. The sample faucet itself, and old school, a lot of sampling was done inside homes. You'd go to a customer's house to get your sample. More for most larger systems now are going to have dedicated sampling points or sample faucets. You have them under your control. You minimize the potential for false positives on anything when we're controlling the sample point, as opposed to a sample point within a customer's home, and I don't know what's happening between the time we were there and the time we were last there. So the book implies that sample points are primarily located in residences or businesses, but in reality, most public systems today are going to have these dedicated sample points. If you look at the exhibit on the screen, that is a schematic of a sample point. It's basically a service line that comes into a secured box that we have the ability to flush, and then we have the ability to pull a sample from. Looking at a picture of a sampling facility, that's what the box looks like from the exterior. Some of the tools of the trade in and around it, but labeled as with the actual, and we have all of our sample points numbered based on the sampling plan and a map showing where they all are. So you look at the procedure for sampling, and this is the inside of that sample point. So the same thing you saw in that schematic, service line coming in, and then a couple different valves that control the flushing portion as well as the sampling portion. So once again, the actual sample procedures. To begin with, the concept of flaming, or literally putting a torch on the end of the sample collection line, is not something that necessarily is standard. The book implies that you don't need to do it. But again, the book is assuming that the sample point is in someone's home. And yeah, you put a torch on somebody's fancy fixture, you can do some damage to it. You can do some damage to their facilities, and we really don't want to do that. So the book suggests you don't really need to, but it's still used by many agencies. It helps to ensure, and the whole point of doing it is to help ensure that we don't have false positives, that we don't have a sample that comes back as positive purely because there was something funky going on with the sample line, as opposed to a problem with the distribution system water itself. So for us, it takes a few seconds to do it. It's belt and suspenders perhaps, but we are trying to avoid having any positives of any kind, false or otherwise. So once you're getting ready to go, you need to flush the sample point. And the goal here is to make sure that the water that we are sampling is coming from our distribution system main line and not from the service line between the main and the sample point. So we need to flush the sample point for long enough to ensure that we're getting water out of the main. And that the amount of time it takes to do can vary depending on the size of your sample line, depending on where the distribution main is. Is it on the near side of the street, the short side, or is it on the far side of the street? The book says you need to flush for somewhere between 2 to 5 minutes. In reality, there's a little trick of the trade. One of the things that we typically look for is, with the understanding that the distribution main is typically deeper underground than the service line, and certainly the portion of the service line that comes up into our sample point. And so that means the water out in the distribution main is literally colder. So as we flush a sample point, we're looking for a temperature change. When that water changes temperature and drops a little bit, then we know we're getting water. Once it drops and stabilizes, we know we're getting water from the distribution main and no longer from that service line. So once we've got the sample good and flushed, then it's a matter of pulling our sample or filling our sample bottle. So we're looking for a relatively smooth, consistent, moderate flow. We're going to fill that bottle, and then we're going to make sure it's properly labeled, and we're going to take it to the laboratory. And then we're going to provide with that sample a document called a chain of custody, which the sampler, the operator pulling the sample, will fill it out, provide all the detailed information about the sample, and then when it goes to the lab, everybody signs off of it. So there is a clear documentation of where the sample was pulled, who pulled it, who he gave it to at the lab. So we have that kind of chain of custody record of the sampling and how it was done and how it ended up at the laboratory. The lab analysis itself is typically going to be done, or is going to be required to be done, by a certified lab. The El Toro Water District maintains a state certified lab. The certification program is called ELAP. So we are capable of doing all of our own bacteriological analysis. We can do all of the ammonia, nitrite, all that stuff as well. We outsource disinfection byproducts, but everything else we can do ourselves, as well as all the wastewater analysis that we do to make sure that the plant is operating properly. There are a number of analytical tests done in the field. They're especially for chlorine. In fact, the chlorine test in the field is typically going to be more accurate than what we would get in the lab because you get a more immediate result. There are very good tools. The chlorimeter you see in front of you on this screen, it's basically just a color test. You put a reagent in the water and then it measures the color to give you an indication of the chlorine content of the drinking water. And the technology has evolved over the years. SL1000 you see here is one of the more, actually it's not even new anymore, it's been out for a few years now. But it has the capability of doing more than just chlorine. It can check for chloramines in their various forms, free chlorine, ammonia, nitrite. So there's a lot we can do out in the field that that we can get a more immediate result than that which we would take back to the lab. And then sometimes you get confirmation at the lab. Again, chlorine, though, the field test is going to be more accurate because the chlorine will dissipate in the sample by the time it gets to the labs. When we're doing chlorine tests, doing the field tests is very important to demonstrate what our actual chlorine residuals are out in the distribution system, which we will be talking about in a lot more detail in future modules.